Every so often, a game comes along that, against all odds and logic, becomes truly loved by a few smitten idiots. I am such an idiot, and Final Fantasy XV is such a game. Its genesis is well told by this point. Stuck in development hell for a decade before being released in 2016, then updated and built upon until finally the release of Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition. A collection of the game, all the extra episodes and updates, and a whole new final chapter thrown in too. It seems like a good time now, 2 years since the game first came out, to try to explain why I love it so much. To truly explain that though, we have to look at the story behind the game, the expanded works in the universe of it, and the utterly unique way that Final Fantasy XV has to be experienced to get the most out of it. This is the story of the strangest game I ever loved. Flawed and glorious all at once, Final Fantasy XV is a true epic. High on the advent of a new console generation, Square Enix announced Fabula Nova Crystallis, a new mythological starting point for their latest Final Fantasy games. The headliner was Final Fantasy XIII, which took that mythology literally and ended up confusing and alienating anybody that couldn't be asked learning their falsies from their lissies. Then there was Final Fantasy Agito 13, which eventually changed name to Final Fantasy Type 0 and used some of the themes and terms from the mythology but went its own way. Then there was Final Fantasy Versus 13, the game that would become 15. Right from the start, there was something special about it. Even though it existed only as a trailer, it was a strong and compelling proof of concept. It showed us a dark, sombre world, similar to our own but fantastical all at once. The music, the combat, the main character effortlessly summoning spiritual swords to do his bidding, everything about the trailer promised a Final Fantasy unlike any other. It's safe to say that out of the 3 games shown, this is the one that grabbed my attention the most, which only made the long wait for any more information more unbearable. We all know what happened next. Final Fantasy XIII became the most divisive game in the series, but somehow spawned 2 equally unpopular sequels, although I still loved them. I'm a sucker. The Final Fantasy name was tarnished a bit after countless spin-offs and cash-ins, and Final Fantasy Versus 13 went radio silent for years. Ages passed where we'd hear nothing of the new game, but every time it seemed certain we'd never see it again, a little ray of hope would appear. A short trailer showing gameplay, a cutscene given as a glimpse of a new character, a fleeting glimpse of the world and mythology of the game. And with every new trailer, however short or insignificant, I became more and more entranced. I wanted to know more about these characters and explore this world and experience what looked to be the most action-heavy battle system of any Final Fantasy to date. For me, it just felt like there was an ambition in Final Fantasy Versus 13, unseen in other games at the time. The PS3 and 360 generation was dominated by games that followed the Uncharted formula, high on spectacle and blockbuster thrills, but a bit shallow for me. Final Fantasy Versus 13 promised something more. An ambition to marry that blockbuster spectacle with the massive scope and depth of a role-playing game. It felt like Final Fantasy Versus 13 was an epic in the making. There was action and there were set pieces, yes, but there was something behind all that. The irresistible pull of a fantastical mythology and a world that just begged to be explored. Early concept trailers introduced it to the twilight city of Insomnia, modelled after Tokyo's Shinjuku district. I've always loved the Yakuza series and its detail-rich depiction of Shinjuku, but the chance to explore Shinjuku with a Final Fantasy twist was too good to be true. And on top of all that, the glimmers of storyline we got from the various trailers and interviews with director Tetsuya Nomura captured my imagination. The prince of a kingdom under siege, a kingdom that was home to the world's last remaining magical crystal, allusions to a goddess of death who imparts visions to the main characters, a world of high-tech, fantastical cityscapes and apocalyptic imagery. I couldn't wait for this game, but the world had to wait for a long, long time before we saw anything else of Final Fantasy Versus 13. E3 2013, years after the last glimpse of Final Fantasy Versus 13, and suddenly... This was it. The game was out of development hell and looked more impressive than ever. That rebrand from Versus 13 to full-on mainline entry number 15 in the series was a statement of intent. This game is coming and it's going to be incredible. We've got to see Noctis' acrobatic and magical combat in action, effortlessly warping around the battlefield and summoning his magic swords at will. We've got to see his buddies in action too, Gladiolus and Prompto defending Noctis from a massive fiend in the courtyard of the now familiar Royal Citadel. There was city-wide destruction, flashbacks to Noctis' childhood and his relationship with his father, our first look at Leviathan and what seemed like a massive cast of characters, all beautifully rendered. Everything pointed to a game of epic scale that married bombastic, world-shattering events with an intimate and personal story spanning years in the life of Noctis. Something was amiss though. Fast forward to the release of the game in 2016 and you'll see why. That chase through the interior of Altissia? Not in the game. That flashback to Noctis and his dad? Not in the game. The fight in the Citadel? Not in the game. The Empire's invasion of Insomnia? Not in the game. In fact, so little of this trailer ended up being in the final game, I sometimes wonder if the trailer negatively impacted how people received it in the end. The next few trailers of the game downplayed the focus on set-piece action. Instead of cities being destroyed and Noctis jumping around falling buildings and collapsing skyscrapers, we got a bunch of folk running about a field, and a bit of driving. It was starting to look like the reality of Final Fantasy XV was far from the fantasy that was created in my mind. Just when the world started to worry yet again that Final Fantasy XV was in trouble, Square Enix released Episode to Sky in March 2015. Episode to Sky was a playable demo of Final Fantasy XV set in the Disgaea region of the map. It was the first chance for anyone to play this game that had been so elusively out of reach for such a long time, and in my opinion it didn't disappoint one bit. In fact, it rejuvenated my interest in the game so much that it's one of my most played demos that I've ever had. I still play it from time to time, even after the release of the full game. It's that good. Here's the pitch. Sometime after the start of the game's story, Noctis and his 4 pals have a broken down car and have to pay for repairs. They wake up in their tent and take on a hunt to raise the funds. You control Noctis and explore the region, getting into fights with the Empire's Magitech troopers and troubling the local populace of, well, these big cute cuddly cow mammoth things. Apparently they're quite a menace.
Never miss.
The crew track down Deadeye, their main prey, only to find out they need some divine help in taking him down. Cue a bit of dungeon exploring, making pals with ancient deity Ramuh, and hey ho, Deadeye is fried by a bolt of lightning, Vulcan style. It doesn't sound like there's much to the demo, but really there is. For starters, it was our first chance to sample Noctis' sword summoning combat style for ourselves. After watching all the various trailers, I finally got my answer to the question of how the hell is this game meant to work? The answer? Unlike anything else I'd played before. It's a weird system. You can block pretty much anything just by holding a button, but it costs magic to do so. You can attack in seemingly endless combos just by holding the attack button down, but that ignores all the depth of the system. The counters and finishers that you can activate manually if you know what you're doing. The warp strikes that make the combat as much about managing space as it is about full-on attacking. It was a hybrid of action and RPG combat that worked for me. And one of the reasons that I loved playing the demo so much is because the combat was so versatile and fun to experiment with. You choose your equipment and set up your attack combos ahead of time in the menu, then take that loadout into combat. Like an action game, your reactions and skills in the battlefield mattered, but like a traditional RPG, half the battle was in your setup before the fighting started. It's a system that changed by the time the final game released. Square Enix decided to change to a more action-focused setup. In the full game, weapons can be switched on the fly mid-combo, making the game play much more like a traditional action game. I think they made the right choice in the end, but Episode to Sky remains a fascinating insight into how the combat evolved. Clearly the idea for Noctis' magic army of weapons came about first in the early concepts of the game, and a lot of time was spent working out how to fully realise that idea in an actual playable game. Another thing Disgaea introduced us to was what would be the foundation of the full game, the relationship between the boys. The focus was less on the epic storyline and more on the nature of the gang's friendship. Their roles ticked the boxes of long-standing archetypes. Ignis was the cool and calm tactician, Gladio was the muscle, and Prompto was the goofy comic relief along for the ride. But they're so charming and well realised that I love spending time in Episode to Sky, getting to know them. We were told it'd still be a long wait for the final game, but I was happy. Episode to Sky proved to me that the game not only existed, but it was on the right track. Game concepts change over time in development. It's rare for entire storylines to change after the public have been made aware of them though. Trailers of Final Fantasy 15 over time started contradicting themselves a bit. Did Noctis fight through the Empire's invasion of Insomnia, or were they out and about in their car when the dropships appeared? Was Final Fantasy 15 still part of the mythology of Final Fantasy 13, or was it something different now? Did we get to explore Insomnia after all? New director Tabata stated in interviews that changes had been made to the storyline we knew to this point, that entire characters had been cut, and though aspects from the original plot remained, the game was no longer part of the Final Fantasy 13 mythology. It was starting to look like the storyline had become a bit of a mess. So, a concept to bring everything together neatly was unveiled to the world, the universe of Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15 was going to be more than just a game. A new demo would introduce young Noctis and tell a little glimpse of his story. A full CGI movie with an all-star cast would show the invasion of the Empire and the fall of Insomnia. An anime series would tell the backstory of the main characters and show the relationship on the road. Not only that, but entire trailers for the game had to be watched to experience the full story. The infamous Dawn trailer, which consists almost entirely of King Regis holding his sleeping son Noctis forlornly, as if hinting at a tragic future for the boy, is absent from the game. This scene is actually pretty pivotal to the relationship between the two characters. Regis knows life's going to be hard for Noctis, but we don't know why till we play the game. You can look at this state of affairs in two ways. One, it's a mess, a complete shambles. You can't play the game without watching the film, or watch the film without playing the game, or watch the anime without knowing where in the game it takes place, or understand the game's characters without first watching all the trailers. Or, two, just roll with it and soak in everything the game's universe has to offer. Unsurprisingly, I went with the latter. The movie, Kingsglaive, is actually a pretty good watch for the most part. It's a shame we don't get to play around in a pre-invasion Insomnia in the final game, but experiencing the city in the film is great. We're introduced to that fantasy based on reality we were promised in 2006. A city similar to Tokyo, but with magic and sorcery and giant statues that come to life and end up destroying the place. Okay, the big fight at the end is an absolute mess, and main character Nyx is a bit of a nothing character, clearly a quick replacement for Noctis who was written out of the invasion sequence late in the day. But we get to see King Regis, old and battered from years of war, making the decision to sacrifice his life and his city for the sake of the future, voiced by Sean fucking Bean, one of my favourite actors. Although as soon as he was announced as the voice actor, we knew how that would end. We get to see Luna Freya, sadly resigned to being something of a damsel in distress, but still, there are hints of what her role in the overarching story is. Something tied to Noctis' destiny, whatever that is.
No.
And wait a minute, all that stuff didn't make it into the final game. It's here! The meeting at the party, the Empire invasion, the car racing through the city highways. The anime, Brotherhood, is brilliant. At a total length of about an hour, it's a fantastic introduction to the main characters and the world around them. We learn how Prompto and Noctis became best pals, how Noctis was a spoiled brat of a kid, and still is as an adult, how Ignis and Gladio helped steer Noctis into being a better, well-rounded person, and most importantly, we learn just how friendly the guys are. At Final Fantasy XV's heart is a story of four guys and the brotherhood they share, and the anime is the perfect encapsulation of that. The Platinum demo, featuring young Noctis, is a weird one. It's simultaneously throwaway and absolutely essential. It features fourth wall breaking gameplay that clearly isn't part of the story, but also has little references to Noctis' relationship with his father that, again, aren't in the final game but are crucial plot points.
Protect you through your darkest dreams.
But you can't play the demo anymore if you didn't download it at the time. So if you missed your chance, then you're out of luck if you want to experience the whole story. It's so weird that Square Enix decided to do it this way. For me and everyone else who was invested in Final Fantasy XV in a big way, the universe of media was like a big reward for our patience. It was acknowledgement that we wanted to immerse ourselves in the world of Final Fantasy XV. But it also created a few issues, the main one being, what order are you meant to do everything in? There's debate amongst Final Fantasy XV fans what the best approach is. Entire Reddit threads are devoted to the subject, and when you add in the DLC episodes that were released after the main game, there's a hell of a lot of hashtag content to get through. Some say to experience each piece of media separately, some say to integrate them chronologically into a playthrough of the main game. Everyone has a different opinion and no one is the right way to do it. Here's my opinion though, and it's simple. Do what you want. Seriously. Every part of the universe of Final Fantasy XV only serves to expand the storyline and mythology, and I don't think it's that important that you watch or play everything in a certain order. The film helps you understand the game more, the game helps you understand the film more, the anime fleshes out the characters, but the game gives context to why they're on the road trip in the first place. If you're at all curious about Final Fantasy XV, it doesn't matter which order you do everything in. All that matters is, if you enjoy the world, there's more for you to explore if you want it. The only important thing is that you mustn't get on the boat in Chapter 9 of the main game until after everything else. That's all, and I'll explain why later. So with the demos, trailers, film and anime series out of the way, it was time for the final game to be released. Final there has about a million inverted commas around it, by the way. Final Fantasy XV kicks off with a flash forward to King Noctis and his retinue facing off against an unknown demigod in pitch darkness outside the Citadel. Here was a promise of things to come, of epic and world-shattering events, darkness and conflict, and a glimpse of a focused future for the four heroes. It was a hint that they wouldn't just be bros on a road trip forever. Then it's a return to the present for a brief explainer for why Noctis and crew are about to go on their road trip.
Merely that you remain at his side.
And then, this.
Unbelievable. Not exactly a fairy tale beginning, huh, Prince Noctis?
As far as JRPG openings go, it's a weird one. A barely interactive sequence where you push a broken down car along a desert road. It's probably about as far removed from the idea of Final Fantasy as you can get. As an introduction to the main characters though, it's flawless. Let's say you weren't like me, that you hadn't soaked up every bit of Final Fantasy XV related media for years and played the demos and read every interview, that your first experience of anything Final Fantasy XV related was simply putting the disc in your console, loading up the game, and suddenly finding yourself pushing a broken down car down the road with these guys. Right from the start, you get it. This is a story of brotherhood and the friendship of four guys on the journey together, through thick and thin. You know serious shit is going to happen, but for now, it's just you and the guys, and it's just perfect. Think of every shitty JRPG opening you've had to sit through. The main character wakes up in a wee village and has to learn combat against a fucking blob, and go to the village square and chase a dog or something, and then they leave the village and do some shitty boring quest in a forest, then they come back and the village is on fire, and then 5 hours later the game finally starts. It makes sense to me now why Square Enix decided to get Noctis and crew out of Insomnia from the start and put all the invasion stuff in a film instead. In Final Fantasy XV, within 10 minutes of starting the game, you're free to wander around in a massive part of the open world. And you've been given just enough hint of the plot, but not enough to bore or overwhelm you. And it's breathtaking, this world. Final Fantasy XV's world is unlike any other. It's sparse, barren, and it's clearly not designed around Noctis' abilities. It could easily be seen as a missed opportunity, another big empty open world with nothing to do, where you endlessly run through fields and deserts towards the next objective marker in the distance. And well, it is all that, but it's also a place I find myself just spending time in, and existing as Noctis and the boys would do. I don't have as much time to play games as I used to nowadays, so it's very rare for me to willfully spend time in a game without achieving much in the way of progress. But I do it all the time in Final Fantasy XV. I choose to take long, slow car journeys instead of using the fast travel option. I stand and watch the sunset. I slowly walk Noctis around the hustle and bustle of towns, listening to what the people have to say. The secret to the world's success and making me want to exist in it is an intangible feeling that not many games have, and it's hard to put into words. I think the closest I can describe it is a feeling of really being there. I'll try and explain. Let's take Grand Theft Auto, probably the best and most successful game series when it comes to open worlds you can get. In every Grand Theft Auto game, no matter how densely packed, how large and open, how full of activities and detail the world is, I can't help but feel that I'm just controlling a wee guy. Just a wee action figure made of polygons. It's hard to explain, but that's how it's always felt. Pretty much every time I play a game that's meant to blow me away with how massive and open it is, I just feel that instead of controlling a real person in a real world, I'm just cutting about as a wee toy, looking down on the world of wee buildings and wee hills and other wee toy people. Does that sound mad? I bet it does. But the game Final Fantasy XV reminds me of most, at least in how it feels, is Shenmue. In Shenmue, Ryo feels like a real person, walking about real streets with minute details and populated by other real people. They might handle like a tank, but I still feel like I, as Ryo, am really there. And in Final Fantasy XV, I feel like I'm really there at ground level, experiencing the world on the same scale as Noctis does. The really impressive and convincing thing that Final Fantasy XV does is how it marries the minutiae and attention to detail of the indoor, up-close moments with the grand scale of an open-world game. No game I've ever played makes the transitions so seamlessly and maintains the feeling of being present in a convincingly sized world. Just walking around the interior of a shop, looking up close at all the details, then slowly walking outside and seeing the entire landscape before you. Never once feeling like I'm controlling a wee action figure or a wee toy. Stuff like that is what makes me want to stay in the world of Lucius and take it all in. As convincing as the world is at making me feel that I'm there though, it's less convincing at telling its story. Everything outside the walls of Insomnia is meant to be a land torn apart from years of war, but something doesn't quite add up.
We're going for a run.
The Vivian Westwood store should be up these stairs.
Did you see that sign? Chocobos! Chocobos!
Despite this, I still love the world of Lucius. It's a world unlike any other fantasy game, a world of petrol stations and magical meteors held up by giants, a world of boring warehouses and breathtakingly impossible landscapes, a world where you can get breakfast at a greasy spoon cafe and play pinball while massive blue dinosaurs wander the fields nearby. What makes it so beguiling and interesting is its similarities to the real world. From the very first promotional material of Final Fantasy Versus 13, we were promised a fantasy based in reality, and that's exactly what it is. It's like the real world, the one where you exist right now watching this video on the internet, but suddenly gods and demons just started cutting about. It's like being at T-Bay Services eating a pork pie and having a good chance of seeing Zeus descend from his mountain and firing a lightning bolt at Sauron before you get back in your car and continue down the M6 toward Preston. Final Fantasy XV's world is just strange enough to be enchanting and just similar enough to be comforting that it rates among the very best video game worlds for me.
Yeah, like something out of a dream.
Just don't fall asleep on me.
I've talked very little about how Final Fantasy XV actually plays so far. At its absolute most basic level, it's an open world action RPG. You roll up to a new town, get some info in the area around, talk to folk to get some fetch quests and hunts, kill a bunch of baddies and do a bunch of tasks until you get itchy feet, then move on to the next town. For all the game's massive development cycle and lofty ambitions to be a standard bearer for JRPGs, it really is very simple. But I like that. It's manageable for one thing. I don't look at the map and sigh with heavy disappointment at a screen full of icons I need to visit to tick off a list. I see beaches and mountains that I want to explore. I see big gruesome beasts that I want to fight and characters that I want to interact with. The main thing you do in Final Fantasy XV, like any RPG, is fight. A lot. The open world lends the combat a kind of breezy, clumsy, make-it-up-as-you-go vibe. Noctis can warp around the battlefield and attack from any angle, but it's just as easy to get caught in the middle of a swarm of killer giraffes butting you with their antlers. A lot of flack has been pointed at the almost automatic combat of the game. You hold down one button and Noctis lets fly with an almost endless flurry of sword swipes. If you get bored, you can freely switch weapons and watch a different animation. Reducing the fighting system down to just holding attack though is pretty unfair. Different attacks are available by moving the left stick or precisely timing when you press the attack button. It's flashy and fun, but there's enough depth that, if you want to, you can become a real master of the game. Defense has that same flashy, simple but deep quality too. Holding down the defend button means Noctis will auto-dodge most attacks at the cost of magic, but there are also last-minute blink dodges, shields with their own defense properties, and a recovery roll that lets you regain health with a perfectly timed button press after being hit. It's a versatile system that lets you really play with what's possible in the game if you want to. The clue there is if you want to. Final Fantasy XV always loads up with the statement, a Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers. And the combat is the main example of that aim. If you want to, you can sail through the main game and not bother with any of the depth of the combat and still enjoy it because of the sheer amount of cool stuff happening on screen. You probably won't get far in the post-game menace dungeons and super bosses, but that's okay. If you want to though, there's a whole other layer of extra dungeons, super tough bosses, secret weapons and items to find and side quests to do. Let's talk about those side quests by the way. They get a lot of flack and I don't think it's entirely fair. A lot of the criticism comes from the fact that they seem so inconsequential. A guy wants you to pick up a carrot or take a photo of a cliff and that's about it. Compared to BitSocket favourite Yakuza, it's a bit bare bones. The Yakuza series always gives every single one of its side quests some bizarre, memorable, touching storyline that elevates them to being just as much fun as the main storyline. At first glance, Final Fantasy XV doesn't. The side quests all seem like mindless fetch quests on the face of it, but they all contribute to fleshing out the world and the lore of the game. My point is this: like a lot of JRPGs, Final Fantasy XV gives back as much as you put in. It can seem like a shallow game if you play it in a particular way, but take your time and immerse yourself in it and, well, you might end up being a smitten idiot just like me, so maybe it's better if you don't do that. Open world games generally have a pacing problem. There's an end goal to achieve, but there's just so much to see and do that the player can easily ignore it and do other stuff endlessly. Most of the time, you can explore every inch of a game's world and tick off every side quest and go to places you aren't meant to see in the storyline. I can't speak for everyone, but for me, I get a strong sense of fatigue with open worlds. I just get bored with the sheer aimlessness of them, and the lack of focus means I tend not to finish off the main quest. Final Fantasy XV does something quite clever to alleviate this feeling for me. When Final Fantasy XIII was released, it was heavily criticised for being linear to a fault. A lot of the time it was simply a game about running in a straight line and watching cutscenes along the way. Great for those that were into the story, but terrible if you weren't. A lot of people weren't. The freedom came around 30 hours in. Suddenly the straight line opened up into a massive plain that could be freely explored, full of hunts that could be done in pretty much any order. For many though, it was too little too late. 30 hours of linear drudgery is hard to stomach just to get access to a big field, even if it is full of dinosaurs. Final Fantasy XV does things the exact opposite way. The game starts with a massive open world to explore, and just when you're itching to see more of the storyline and leave the side questing and hunting behind, the gang get on a boat to the overseas city of Altissia, and you're funneled into a linear rollercoaster of revelations until the end of the story. For me, this is an alright solution to the open world problem. It has the advantages of having a big world to explore and get lost in, but it keeps the advantages of linear storytelling when it wants to focus the player on concluding the storyline. It's not a perfect solution. If you decide to, you can do most of the side quests before you get on the boat, meaning Noctis and pals will be ridiculously super leveled with the foes ahead. But the game knows this and has some devious tricks to counter your over leveled gang and make sure you haven't ruined the experience for yourself. Final Fantasy XV's story, like many JRPGs, is about gods. It's a fascination the genre has had since almost the very beginning, but most of the time God exists as the ultimate final boss to kill at the end. After all, you really can't get more powerful than the Almighty when it comes to final bosses. The gods in Final Fantasy XV exist on their own terms though. Yes, you fight them, of course you fight them, but I've always had the feeling that Final Fantasy XV treats its gods, or astrals as they're called, a bit more delicately than other JRPGs that I've played and loved over the years. They're mysterious, epic in scale, unpredictable in when they decide to turn up, and they can be friends or foes along the way. The quests to enlist the help of Titan and Ramuh result in enjoyable but predictably video gamey results, a big fight and a trip to a magic cave respectively. But when Noctis arrives in Altissia to forge his covenant with Leviathan, I felt that something foreboding and epic and awful and important was about to happen. Up until this point, the feeling of being on a road trip with the boys made the story feel quite breezy and fun, even with the early events where the entire Crown City is destroyed and half the population are presumably killed. Cheer up Noct, road trip! But Altissia is where all the story's threads begin to intertwine. Luna is a political hostage, and Noctis' crew enjoy what are to be their last moments of unburdened happiness together. They even make a stop at the Vivian Westwood shop to glimpse what was meant to be Luna's dress on her wedding day with Noctis.
And that's the dress. My word.
The boys idealistically decide the wedding has to go ahead once they've taken care of the Empire. But then, Luna talks to a god, and nothing is the same afterwards. Leviathan's conversation with Luna is the first time any of the Astral's speech is subtitled, and the ensuing cutscene still fills me with this strange, nightmarish sensation. There's just something about the way the game depicts the relationship between gods and humans. Leviathan has a grudging contempt for what she calls specks, looking down on them for their low existence, beneath the understanding of the universe that she has. The first time I played through the game and got to this sequence, I felt like the level of storytelling had matured. There was a complexity and depth that was rare for the genre, and it surprised me. I felt rewarded for my patience, having waited so long to play this game.
I know what you must know. That the King of Kings is to drive the darkness from our star.
And then, with a literal twist of the knife, everything started to unravel, and I knew I was playing a game that would affect me like few others. Arden finally reveals himself as the game's primary villain. Luna, the woman Noctis had waited most of his life to see again, is killed before they get the chance to meet. And, most heartbreakingly, Ignis loses his sight, while Noctis does his Superman thing trying to prove himself to Leviathan. The status quo of the game is gone. Nothing will be the same again for any of our characters. I described it as an emotional gut punch in my review of Pocket Edition of Final Fantasy XV, and I stand by that. If you had built up a connection with the characters and world up to that point, by consuming all the extra media and taking your time to explore with the boys and listen to all their chatter, The succeeding events carry weight and importance and poignancy. It feels wrong and unfair. You're in Noctis' shoes and your entire world is being ripped apart. And the beautiful exchange between Noctis and Luna as she succumbs to her ethereal, otherworldly death, Noctis, in child form, sums up his feelings perfectly. It's not right.
All I wanted was to save you.
After this is when the game plays its trick to ensure you haven't over-leveled. Noctis' strength is drawn from his friends, and so the game takes him away from you one by one. Ignis can't be counted on to save the day without his sight. Noctis is cruelly tricked into betraying his best friend Prompto, who falls off the train and is abandoned. And then, finally, Gladio is taken away, along with Noctis' magical armoury. When Noctis enters the gates of the Empire's capital, he's alone and powerless, and no amount of JRPG levelling up can save him from the horrors that follow. If you read or heard anything about Final Fantasy XV around its original release, you'll know about the infamous Chapter 13. It's a survival horror-inspired linear procession of narrow, dark corridors, where Noctis can't use his weapons, so has to stealthily creep around the demons and nightmarish Magitech troopers that lurk in the shadows. It's also very, very long. Chapter 13 can easily test one's resolve, but allow me to defend it, at least a little bit. The first time I got to Chapter 13, I was up late playing the PS4 at around midnight, and I had my headphones plugged in. I was in the zone. Noctis had lost Luna, his pals, his powers, and his car, and I was right there with him. I felt as hopeless as he did, but I was resolved to see the journey through together with him. I needed to know what happened next, to get to the light that had to be at the end of the tunnel. When Noctis finally decides to wear the ring given to him by Luna and take on the burden of being king, it's when he's at his lowest point emotionally. And his reward? Limited powers to just about keep the demons at bay. I understand that Chapter 13's design is frustrating and disappointing after a game that has had so much freedom, but its limitations and choices were absolutely necessary for its effect to work. On that night when I first played through it, I couldn't put the controller down because it was so gripped by tension. By taking away every advantage I had had up to that point in the game, there was nothing left to focus on but the feelings and emotional state of the character I was in control of. In that regard, I count Chapter 13 a success. I was also intrigued to learn about what the hell happened to the Empire. Throughout the story, the Empire is a force of intimidating strength and might, but upon visiting the capital it turns out to have been a facade. It's a ghost town, and something horrible must have happened. I loved the mystery, left just nebulous enough to allow my imagination to wonder at the possibilities. The storytelling was perhaps too loose and slight though, which is where the first of many updates and patches came into play. It's at this point that the water started to muddy in terms of the game's overall quality. The update to Chapter 13 is an obvious plaster over a sore bit in the game. It's not the only one either. Play the game today and it's full of little bits and pieces added over the 2 years since the original release. Extra cutscenes with characters we wish we had more screen time, characters literally explaining the lore of the world where once it was left a mystery. These extra scenes are, overall, pretty jarring. If they'd only taken the time to integrate them properly and animate them to the same quality as the game's set-piece moments, they wouldn't be as noticeable. Now's probably a good time to bring up some of the things I really don't like about Final Fantasy XV. It's not perfect, anybody can see that. It's glitchy for one thing. The magic system's underbaked and some of the big bosses end up being quite boring. The quality is inconsistent throughout the game too. There are times when Final Fantasy XV might very well be the most beautiful game I've ever seen, and then there are other times when it's, well, not. Cutscenes are the main victim. Some cutscenes are beautifully animated and lit, polished to their limit, while most conversations and cutscenes are just procedurally animated, stock lighting, bargain basement affairs. A big issue for me is how disconnected the world can feel. The main landmass of Lucius is huge and a joy to explore, but Altissia is its own wee separate bit and you have to talk to a magic dog if you want to explore it again. Then there's Niflheim, which you can never return to, and Insomnia, the city I was so desperate to explore all these years, but again needs the aid of a magic dog to explore freely. Plus, it's in a nightmarish post-apocalyptic state. Not much fun to just hang about in, but great for grinding. If you bought Final Fantasy XV on day one, you'd be forgiven for thinking you bought an unfinished game. That major feeling of inconsistency and missing content throughout the experience may have been bandaged over time, but the release of Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition was a major step in making the game feel, finally, complete. If you sat down and played the Royal Edition now, without knowledge of Final Fantasy XV's history or its original state, I think it'd do a much better job of giving you a full experience without any obvious signs or seams. It's easier and much more seamless to travel now. There's something to be said for just being able to get in your car on one side of the map, drive over to the other side, get in a boat, sail across the ocean and get off again at the other side, all without having to talk to a magic dog. It goes a long way towards making the world feel cohesive and whole. If there's a sure sign of the game being complete now, it's this fan-made trailer that recreates Final Fantasy XV's epic E3 2013 reveal entirely with material from the game as it is today. All that content wasn't cut after all, it just changed and morphed into something slightly different, but still great. If anything, it's a sign that Square Enix, as with many of their projects, revealed Final Fantasy XV far too early in development and have been playing catch up till now. But the main casualty of Final Fantasy XV's long, messy development is the soundtrack. Now, you have to understand, I bought the soundtrack in iTunes as soon as I could. The high points of the soundtrack are beautiful, epic and majestic pieces of operatic wonder, and I simply had to have them. But the low points are awful. Play the Platinum demo and this wonderful music plays in Altissia. But in the full game, it's replaced with the kind of thing you get in a cartoon parody where folk go on holiday to Europe. Lestalem, the game's other main city, and every petrol station you stop at all have terrible backing music too. It's a real shame because when the music's good in this game, it can send shivers down you. This is where I make my boldest argument for Final Fantasy XV. To me, Final Fantasy XV is a true epic, and its themes, structure, symbolism and journey, together with the soundtrack, when it's good, are like a grand musical or an opera. Really though, it's a story of gods and men, of grand armies and plucky heroes, of tragic destiny and joyful friendship. Like many great epics, the world and background lore is labyrinthine, dense with alliances and countless characters, but the main story is so simple. It isn't an anime fest like Final Fantasy XIII was, but a hero's journey in the tradition of stories told since forever. Luna doesn't get a lot of screen time before she meets her end, but she gets some of the best, most powerful scenes in the game. Facing down a god, brushing off a rifle in defiance, and the moment where you finally get to see her wedding dress. It's her moment of death that marks the end of the innocence of the first act. Like when the curtain falls at the end of the first act of a play, you know the next time the curtain rises, the characters will have to move onwards through the pain towards their goal. The second and third acts are full of operatic plot devices, Deus Ex Machina, and a rousing bombastic score as the worldly and otherworldly collide. Earlier I said it doesn't matter what order you experience all the various Final Fantasy XV materials in, as long as you play Chapter 9 after you've soaked it all in. That's because everything before Chapter 9, the movie and the anime series, all contribute to building a world, and everything after Chapter 9 is the final, unavoidable quest to save that world. The plot is messy and incomprehensible up to that point, but then it reveals itself in its classic simplicity. A quest to save the world from the most primal of human fears, darkness itself. I don't think you can get more operatic, more classically epic than that. The final chapter of the game sees Noctis and crew return to the destroyed home city of Insomnia, 10 years older. It's reminiscent of the scourging of the Shire from Lord of the Rings. In those 10 years, Noctis has been sleeping, meditating and coming to terms with his destiny, while the boys help the remainders of humanity fend off the demons of the night. Upon their return home, the relationship has changed between them. They're still friends, but there's an uneasiness in their voices. They all know that to save the world, Noctis has to make a sacrifice. There's a solemn, elegiac feeling as the boys make their way through the streets and then back to the Citadel. The Royal Edition of the game greatly expanded this chapter, which actually almost worked to its detriment because the feeling of loneliness was diminished thanks to a visit from some old friends. When Noctis and crew face down Ifrit, the demon from the game's prologue, it's the cue for a battle amongst the gods. Again, a nod towards the operatic. The events are epic and earth-shattering, but they're ended with a kiss rather than a slash of a sword. It's after the dust has settled that the story reaches its true climax. A quiet reflection on the journey the boys have taken, an empty throne, a duel between a jealous usurper and a true king. Noctis sacrifices himself and asks the ghost of his father to trust him with his burden. If all of this sounds like I'm getting a bit too into the game's story, it's only because I am. At many stages throughout the game or its other materials, most sensible people will have been lost, and for good reason. But for me, the more I put into the world, the more involved I got in seeing the story through to its conclusion, and I genuinely think that Noctis' journey is one of the great stories that will stay with me. Final Fantasy XV has been called many things. A joke, a disaster, a failure, a misstep. But as Noctis faded into oblivion after his deed was done, as the sun rose for the first time on the world that I spent so much of my life in, and as Luna joined Noctis in their wedding in the afterlife, I honestly felt like I witnessed a true epic. a game unlike anything else I'd played. For me, it's a masterpiece, and I hope that one day it might be remembered that way.